March 1942. The jungles of Bataan, Philippines. The heat pressed down like wet wool. In the shadows beneath tangled vines and palm fronds, Japanese soldiers moved with the practiced silence of men trained to believe their lives belonged to the emperor. They had been taught this since childhood: duty above breath, honor above survival, death before disgrace. Surrender was not a word in their vocabulary. It was worse than death. It was erasure. For 3 months, they had pushed American and Filipino forces back across the peninsula, through swamps and across rivers, under a sun that seemed to burn with the righteousness of their cause. Every victory reinforced what they already knew: Japan was destined to rule the Pacific. America was weak, soft, addicted to comfort. The enemy would crumble like paper in rain. But war does not care what men believe. By 1943, the tide had shifted. Island by island, the Americans advanced across the Pacific, their industrial might pouring steel and fire onto beaches where Japanese soldiers had dug into coral and volcanic rock. The Imperial Army's doctrine held firm: fight to the last man, take as many enemies as possible, die with honor intact. Those who were captured, wounded, unconscious, or simply overwhelmed, woke to a terror deeper than physical pain. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In their minds they were already dead. Worse, they were ghosts, shadows of men who had failed their emperor, their families, their ancestors, stretching back through generations. American intelligence officers, reading through captured documents and interrogating the few prisoners willing to speak, began to understand the depth of this conditioning. It wasn't just military discipline. It was spiritual certainty. One document, preserved in the National Archives, recorded the words of a captured lieutenant: "We were told that Americans would torture us, that they would display us in cages like animals, that death in battle was mercy compared to the humiliation of surrender." The prisoners expected brutality. They expected cruelty refined by Western coldness. They expected to be stripped of humanity and ground into nothing. What they found instead would shake the foundations of everything they believed. The first transport ships carried Japanese POWs from Pacific battlefields to the American mainland in late 1942 and early 1943. The men sat in the holds, silent, waiting. Some believed they were being taken to execution sites. Others thought they might be used for medical experiments, rumors fueled by their own military's treatment of prisoners. When the ships docked at West Coast ports, San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, the prisoners were marched down gangplanks under armed guard. They kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched, expecting blows that never came. The docks smelled of salt water and diesel fuel. Gulls cried overhead. American soldiers stood in formation, rifles ready but not raised. The prisoners were loaded onto trains, old passenger cars with barred windows. As the trains rolled eastward across California, through deserts and mountain passes, the men pressed their faces to the glass, watching a landscape so vast it seemed impossible. They had been told America was crowded, weak, running out of resources. Instead, they saw endless fields, factories belching smoke into clear skies, highways filled with civilian automobiles. One prisoner, whose account was recorded decades later by researchers at the University of California, described his first impression: "I thought we were being shown a lie, like a movie set. How could any nation have so much and still be at war? Where were the signs of suffering?" The trains carried them to camps scattered across the American interior: Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Wisconsin, Arkansas. The War Department had prepared these facilities according to the Geneva Convention, inspected by the International Red Cross, designed to hold thousands of men in secure but humane conditions. The prisoners stepped off the trains into a world that made no sense. April 1943. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The camp emerged from the landscape like a small city. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in perfect lines. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers with rifles. A perimeter fence, barbed wire catching the spring sunlight, enclosed several acres of open ground. Inside that fence, Japanese prisoners expected to find their worst nightmares made real. Instead, they found something far more disturbing: routine. The processing began immediately. Each prisoner was logged, photographed, given a medical examination. American doctors, working through interpreters, checked for diseases, parasites, untreated wounds. Men who had spent months in jungle fighting, who bore scars from shrapnel and malaria, found themselves being treated with antibiotics, bandages changed daily, wounds cleaned and stitched. No one beat them. No one spat at them. The doctors worked with clinical efficiency, noting symptoms in files that would follow each man through his captivity. This was the first shock. They mattered. Not as human beings perhaps, but as inventory. The Americans kept records of everything: names, ranks, medical conditions, dietary needs. It was the opposite of the chaos they expected. One prisoner, Yukio Yamamoto, described the experience years later: "I thought they would kill us quickly or slowly. Instead, they gave me a number, took my photograph, and handed me clean clothes. I didn't understand. What kind of enemy does this?" The camps themselves defied expectation. Yes, there were fences and guards. Yes, there were rules and restrictions. But inside the compounds, the prisoners discovered facilities that seemed almost absurd in their completeness. Mess halls where they ate 3 meals a day. Bathhouses with hot water. Latrines that were cleaned regularly. Even recreation areas where, eventually, they would be allowed to play baseball and volleyball. The food was the second shock. Rice, yes, but also bread, vegetables, sometimes meat. The rations were calculated according to military standards, the same calories provided to American soldiers in training. It wasn't luxurious, but it was consistent and sufficient. Men who had watched their comrades starve on Pacific islands, who had boiled roots and eaten insects to survive, found themselves gaining weight in captivity. This should have been relief. Instead, it was horror. Because if the Americans treated prisoners well, what did that say about everything they had been taught? If the enemy was humane, what did that make Japan's own treatment of captives? The questions gnawed at them in the night, in the silence between meals, in the moments when their minds weren't occupied by the strange routines of camp life. The prisoners were divided into compounds based on when and where they had been captured. Officers were separated from enlisted men, hardliners from those willing to cooperate. The Americans had learned, through bitter experience on the islands, that some Japanese prisoners remained fanatically loyal, attempting suicide or attacking guards. Others, particularly those captured while unconscious or severely wounded, showed a quiet willingness to adapt. Within the compounds, a strange social order began to emerge. Some men clung to military discipline, organizing themselves into squads, maintaining the formal hierarchies of the Imperial Army. Others, younger mostly farm boys and conscripts, drifted toward a different kind of structure, one based on survival in this new, bewildering environment. The camp administrators, following War Department policy, allowed prisoners a degree of self-governance. They could elect representatives, organize work details, manage their own recreation. This was strategy, not kindness. Happy prisoners, the theory went, caused fewer problems. But to the Japanese POWs, it felt like another crack in the walls of their understanding. Why would the enemy give them any power at all? The first days in camp were marked by silence. Men moved through the routines like automatons, eating, sleeping, standing for roll call, never speaking more than necessary. Some refused to make eye contact with guards or fellow prisoners, as if acknowledging this new reality would make it permanent. But reality has a way of wearing down resistance. By the end of the first week, small changes appeared. A man laughing at something another prisoner said. 2 soldiers sharing a cigarette, American tobacco, given out by guards who seemed bored rather than cruel. The sound of conversation, tentative, spreading through the barracks like water finding cracks in stone. They were still prisoners. They were still defeated. But they were also impossibly alive. And that fact, that stubborn continuation of breath and heartbeat, demanded acknowledgement. Summer 1943. Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The desert heat was different from the jungle heat they had known. Dry, relentless, it sucked moisture from skin and turned the air brittle. At night, temperatures dropped until men shivered in their bunks, and used to cold after years in the Pacific. But the weather was the least of their concerns. By summer, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm. Work details took men outside the camps during the day: road maintenance, agricultural labor, forestry. The War Manpower Commission had authorized POW labor to address shortages caused by Americans serving overseas. Under Geneva Convention rules, prisoners couldn't be forced to work on military projects, but they could volunteer for civilian tasks in exchange for small wages paid in camp scrip. Most volunteered. Partly for the money, which could buy cigarettes, soap, and writing materials at the camp canteen. Partly for something to do, something to break the monotony of barracks life. But also, increasingly, because the work took them into American communities where they could see, with their own eyes, how ordinary people lived. This was when the propaganda truly began to crumble. Japanese soldiers had been told that America was on the verge of collapse, that its people were starving, that the war effort had drained the nation dry. Instead, prisoners working on farms in Texas and California saw mechanized agriculture on a scale that seemed impossible. One combined harvester did the work of 100 men. Trucks moved crops in quantities that would have required entire train systems in Japan. A prisoner named Takeshi Nakamura, working on a ranch near Fort Worth, wrote in a diary later recovered by historians, "We harvested more wheat in one day than my father's village produced in an entire season." The owner, an old man with white hair, said his son was fighting in Europe. Yet still there was excess. How can you defeat a nation that has excess? The civilian Americans they encountered added to their confusion. Some were hostile, refusing to speak to the prisoners or watching them with barely concealed anger. But others were matter-of-fact, treating the work as work, the prisoners as temporary labor. A few even showed something like friendliness, offering water on hot days, nodding in approval when a job was done well. This casual humanity was perhaps more devastating than cruelty would have been. It made the prisoners individuals again, not just defeated enemies. And with individuality came memory, conscience, all the things military indoctrination tried to strip away. Inside the camps, another crisis was unfolding. Letters had begun to arrive from Japan, processed through neutral countries, taking months to travel but eventually reaching their destinations. The International Red Cross, despite the war, maintained communication channels for POW correspondence. American authorities allowed prisoners to send and receive mail, censored but intact. For many prisoners, these letters were the first contact with families who had believed them dead. Mothers who had held funerals. Wives who had begun wearing widow's white. Children who had only photographs to remember fathers by. The letters spoke of hardship in Japan. Food rationing severe now. Air raids on cities. Factories working around the clock. But also something else, a growing confusion. Because the families had been told their sons and husbands died honorably in battle. Now they learned these men were alive in American captivity, and, according to the brief lines allowed in censored correspondence, being treated according to international law. One mother wrote to her son, a message preserved in military archives: "We held services for you. Your name is on the memorial. How can you return from the dead? What will the neighbors say?" The shame was not just the prisoners. It extended back home, contaminating families, communities. This was the cruelest aspect of Japanese military culture. The stain of defeat touched everyone connected to the defeated. Some prisoners stopped writing. Others wrote letters they knew would never be sent, pouring out confessions and questions onto paper that they burned in secret. A few tried to maintain the fiction, writing bland descriptions of camp life without mentioning the food, the medical care, the strange mercy of their captors. But the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The camp administrators, particularly those with experience in psychology and interrogation, began to notice a pattern. Prisoners who had been most fanatically loyal in the early days were slowly changing. Not all of them and not quickly. But the rigid certainty that had sustained them through capture and transport was developing fractures. The Americans encouraged this carefully. They showed films of American life. Propaganda, yes, but propaganda rooted in actual footage of factories, farms, cities. They distributed magazines and newspapers, censored but revealing. They allowed prisoners who cooperated to have small privileges, nothing dramatic, but enough to create visible differences between those who clung to old beliefs and those who adapted. It was psychological warfare, executed with patience and precision. The goal wasn't to turn Japanese soldiers into Americans. It was simply to make them question what they had been taught. To insert doubt where certainty had been absolute. And it was working. Fall 1943 to spring 1944. Multiple camps across the American interior. The phrase emerged sometime in late 1943, whispered in barracks after lights out, appearing in diary entries and letters never sent. Rakuen. Paradise. Not paradise as in luxury or ease. Paradise as in a world that shouldn't exist, that violated everything they understood about war, enemies, and the nature of defeat. The dental care was what broke through to many. American military regulations required that POWs receive medical and dental treatment equivalent to that given to U.S. soldiers. When prisoners complained of toothaches, they were taken to camp dentists, actual trained doctors with equipment, who filled cavities and extracted infected teeth with anesthesia. Anesthesia. For prisoners. For enemies who would have died trying to kill American soldiers. One prisoner, in a letter that was confiscated by camp censors and preserved in archives, wrote, "They fix our teeth. They give us medicine for pain. What? We are nothing to them. We failed our emperor. Yet they treat us as if we matter. I cannot sleep anymore. Nothing makes sense." The libraries were another source of cognitive dissonance. Camp administrators, following Red Cross guidelines, provided reading materials. Mostly Japanese books donated by American universities and cultural organizations. Classic literature, technical manuals, even some translated American novels. The idea was to keep prisoners occupied, to reduce tensions that could lead to violence. But the prisoners read more than just entertainment. They read and they began to learn. Some studied English, driven by practical need to communicate with guards and administrators. Others devoured any information they could find about America, trying to understand how this nation could be simultaneously fighting a brutal war and treating its captive enemies with what seemed like careful consideration. The concept of individual rights, so central to American thought, was particularly alien. In Japan, the group superseded the self. The emperor, the nation, the family, all took precedence over personal desire or comfort. Here, even as prisoners, they were treated as individuals with basic needs and entitlements. It was horrifying. It was seductive. It made them question whether they had ever been individuals at all, or just components in a machine that had used them and discarded them. The work programs intensified the crisis. By 1944, labor shortages in agriculture had become critical. Thousands of American men were overseas. Women had moved into factory work. The harvest needed hands and the POW camps provided them. Prisoners found themselves working alongside civilian Americans, Mexican-American laborers, even black workers in the segregated South. The racial dynamics shocked them. They had been taught that America was weak because of its racial mixing, that white Americans were decadent and non-whites inferior. Instead, they saw a complex system where racial tensions existed but didn't prevent cooperation when necessary. On one Louisiana farm, a group of Japanese prisoners worked a sugarcane harvest alongside black sharecroppers. The foreman, a white overseer, treated both groups roughly but equally. The prisoners noticed that the black workers, despite being American citizens, seemed to have little more freedom than they did. This observation appeared in several prisoner accounts, sowing confusion about the American promise of equality. Yet even in those contradictions, even in America's own failings, there was something fundamentally different from what they had known. The contradictions were visible. Americans argued about their own flaws, in newspapers the prisoners could read, in conversations they could overhear. This public self-criticism was incomprehensible to men raised in a system where questioning national policy was treason. The camp canteens became symbols of the inexplicable American approach. Prisoners could earn scrip, roughly 80 cents a day for voluntary labor. With this scrip they could purchase items at camp stores. Cigarettes, yes. Soap and toiletries. But also luxury items that seemed obscene given the context. Chocolate. Musical instruments. Art supplies. Baseball gloves. One prisoner bought a harmonica and taught himself to play American folk songs. Another purchased watercolors and began painting landscapes of the New Mexican desert, a terrain so different from anything in Japan that rendering it felt like documenting an alien planet. These small acts of creation, of personal expression, were revolutionary for men who had been taught that their individual desires meant nothing. The camp at Heart Mountain, Wyoming, offered perhaps the strangest juxtaposition. There, Japanese-American citizens who had been forcibly relocated from the West Coast were held in what the government called relocation centers but what were, functionally, prison camps for American civilians guilty only of their ancestry. Japanese POWs, enemy soldiers, had better conditions than Japanese Americans, citizens whose only crime was their heritage. Some prisoners learned of this through newspapers, through conversations with guards who seemed embarrassed by the arrangement. The irony was too perfect, too damning. If America imprisoned its own Japanese citizens, what did that say about the moral high ground it claimed? Yet even that injustice was addressed publicly, in courts, in newspapers that prisoners could access. Japanese-American lawyers fought the relocations. Some Japanese-American soldiers served with distinction in Europe while their families remained behind barbed wire in American soil. The prisoners could see the tension, the contradictions, the slow working of a system that allowed for criticism and change. It was messy and hypocritical and nothing like the clean certainties of imperial propaganda. And some of them began to think, messy might be more honest than clean. By spring 1944, the camps had developed distinct cultures. Some remained dominated by hardliners, officers and senior NCOs who maintained rigid discipline and punished any prisoner suspected of cooperation with the enemy. In these compounds, men lived in fear of their own comrades, knowing that being labeled a traitor meant beatings or worse. Other camps, particularly those holding prisoners captured more recently, developed a different atmosphere. More open. More willing to engage with the reality of their situation. In these places, prisoners played baseball with American guards, formed work crews that operated with minimal supervision, even attended educational classes where they learned about American history and government. The split in prisoner attitudes reflected a deeper crisis. What did it mean to maintain honor when honor demanded loyalty to a cause that might not be honorable? What did it mean to keep faith with an emperor who had sent them to die, when the enemy treated them better than their own side ever had? These questions had no easy answers. But they were being asked, in the privacy of thoughts that could not be shared, in the quiet moments between wake and sleep when a man confronts what he truly believes. The Americans, watching through informants and psychological assessments, saw the divisions and used them. Cooperative prisoners were given privileges. Hardliners were isolated. The strategy was pragmatic. Willing POWs caused fewer problems, required less security, and might eventually provide useful intelligence. But there was also, in some administrators, a genuine belief that treating prisoners well was simply the right thing to do. The Geneva Convention provided the framework, but individual Americans brought their own ethics to the work. Some had studied in Japan before the war. Others simply held to principles that transcended nationality. These men, these American officers and enlisted guards, probably never knew the depth of the crisis they had created in the minds of their captives. They were following regulations, doing their jobs, trying to get through the war like everyone else. They didn't realize they were destroying a worldview. June 1944. Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The news reached the camp through official channels and unofficial whispers simultaneously. D-Day. Allied forces landing in Normandy. The beginning of the end for Germany. For Japanese prisoners in American camps, the news had complex implications. Germany's eventual defeat would leave Japan isolated, facing the full weight of American industrial might. But more immediately, the reports from Europe highlighted something the prisoners had been trying not to see. The Americans were winning. Not through brutality or spiritual superiority, but through organization, technology, and the capacity to sustain massive military operations across multiple continents simultaneously. The evidence was everywhere. The guards at the camps were often older men, or those deemed unsuitable for combat duty. The young, fit soldiers were overseas. Yet America still had enough manpower to run hundreds of POW camps, maintain security, provide medical care, all while fighting wars in both Europe and the Pacific. The industrial capacity was even more telling. Prisoners working in agriculture saw endless convoys of new trucks, tractors, equipment rolling off assembly lines. The guards carried rifles that were standardized, plentiful. The food rations never ran short. Even in small details, the quality of the boots guards wore, the presence of new uniforms, the waste that seemed built into the system, the overwhelming scale of American production was visible. One prisoner, Hiroshi Tanaka, captured on Saipan and transferred to Iowa, described a moment of recognition. "I was working on a farm near the camp. A tractor broke down. The farmer, instead of fixing it, simply called for a replacement. He said it wasn't worth the effort to repair. In Japan we would have used that tractor until it fell apart, then used the parts to fix 2 other machines. Here they had so much that even waste was acceptable. In that moment I understood. We could never win this war. We had already lost it before we began." The prisoners had time to think, perhaps too much time. In the barracks at night, conversations that would have been unthinkable a year before now happened in hushed voices. What if the emperor was wrong? What if the military leadership had lied? What if surrender wasn't dishonor but simple recognition of reality? Some prisoners refused to engage with these questions, shutting down anyone who voiced doubt. But others, particularly the younger ones, found themselves unable to stop thinking. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they experienced daily had become unbearable. The letters from home made it worse. By mid-1944, American bombing raids on Japan had intensified. Families wrote of fire, of destroyed homes, of food so scarce that people survived on rations that would have been insulting even in the worst prisoner camps. The civilians in Japan were suffering more than the soldiers in American captivity. How could that be just? How could that serve any purpose beyond prolonging the inevitable? The turning point for many came not from a single dramatic event but from accumulated small recognitions. A guard sharing a cigarette and asking about a prisoner's family. A doctor treating a wound with the same care given to American soldiers. A Red Cross inspector noting conditions and making recommendations that were actually implemented. The Americans weren't perfect, weren't saints, but they were trying to follow rules that applied even to enemies. This concept, that rules could apply equally, that might didn't automatically make right, was revolutionary. In traditional Japanese thought, the strong ruled and the weak obeyed. Power justified itself. The emperor's will was absolute because he held power. But here was a system where power was constrained by law, where even captive enemies had rights that their captors acknowledged and respected. Some prisoners began to study American government and law, reading whatever materials they could access. The Constitution, with its checks and balances, its explicit limitations on government power, was fascinating and disturbing. The idea that a government could be designed to prevent tyranny, that leaders could be questioned and replaced, challenged everything about the divine right of the emperor. One group of prisoners at Camp Kennedy, Texas, organized what they called a democracy club. They held mock elections, debated issues, practiced the forms of self-governance they had read about. The camp administrators allowed it, seeing it as harmless recreation that kept the men occupied. But for the prisoners involved it was profound. For the first time in their lives, they were making choices collectively, debating openly, disagreeing without violence. The process was crude and imperfect, but it planted seeds that would grow in unexpected ways after the war. Not everyone embraced these changes. In some camps, hardline prisoners formed secret organizations dedicated to maintaining military discipline and punishing cooperators. There were beatings, sometimes killings. American administrators, when they discovered these underground groups, moved prisoners between camps, isolating the most dangerous hardliners. But the violence itself revealed the desperation of those clinging to old beliefs. They could see what was happening. The erosion of certainty. The spread of doubt. They fought it with the only tools they had left: intimidation and force. It wasn't enough. The dam had cracked. Water was seeping through. By late 1944, the psychological transformation of many prisoners was advanced enough that camp administrators began segregating them more carefully. Those who cooperated with American authorities, who provided intelligence about the Japanese military, who explicitly rejected the emperor's claim to divinity, were moved to special camps where they wouldn't be targeted by hardliners. These prisoners, called collaborators by some and realists by others, faced an uncertain future. They could not return to Japan as heroes. Many wouldn't return at all, choosing to remain in America after the war, building new lives under new names, cutting themselves off from families and histories that no longer fit who they had become. But that was later. In 1944 they were still prisoners, still uncertain, still caught between the world they had known and the world they were discovering. The turning point wasn't a moment. It was a season, A slow pivot from absolute certainty to qualified doubt, from unquestioning loyalty to critical thought. Not all prisoners made this turn. But enough did that the camps became, in effect, laboratories for ideological transformation. The Americans mostly didn't understand what they had created. They saw cooperation and called it success. They saw prisoners adapting and assumed it was pragmatism. Few recognized that they were witnessing a profound crisis of faith, a breaking and remaking of identity that would echo through decades. The prisoners themselves rarely articulated it clearly. How do you explain that the enemy you were taught to hate showed you more humanity than your own leaders? How do you tell your family that you learned more about honor from defeat than from victory? You don't. You carry it silently, a weight that never quite dissipates, a question that never fully resolves. By the end of 1944, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Japan would lose. The only questions were when and how badly. The prisoners in American camps knew this, even if they couldn't say it aloud. And some of them, in the private spaces of their own thoughts, were preparing for a different kind of future. One where the old certainties had crumbled and new questions had to be confronted, not with slogans or propaganda, but with the difficult work of honest reflection. The paradise they had found wasn't paradise at all. It was just humanity, imperfect and contradictory, trying to find decency even in war. But to men raised in a system that had denied them humanity, that had turned them into instruments of national will, even imperfect humanity felt like revelation. August 1945. Camps across America. The announcement came over loudspeakers in Japanese and English. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. In the camps, men received the news in silence. Some collapsed. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they had heard. A few wept openly, though whether from relief or despair, even they couldn't say. The hardliners refused to believe it. They declared it American propaganda, a psychological trick. The emperor would never surrender. Japan would fight to the last man just as they had been taught. The Americans were lying. But more information came. Details of atomic bombs, of Soviet invasion of Manchuria, of meetings and decisions, and the emperor's own voice on the radio, something that had never happened before, telling his people that the war was lost and they must endure the unendurable. For prisoners who had spent 2 or 3 years in American captivity, the end of the war brought a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Fear of what came next. Shame that they had survived when so many had died. And underneath everything, a deeper crisis. What did it mean that they had been right? That their doubt, their questioning, their slow acceptance that Japan could not win had been accurate? Did that make them wise or treacherous? The camps themselves didn't change much immediately. The prisoners were still prisoners, still under guard, still behind wire. The Geneva Convention required that they be repatriated as quickly as possible, but the logistics of transporting thousands of men across the Pacific while the region was still in chaos took time. So they waited. And in the waiting they had to confront who they would be when they returned. Some prisoners made a different choice. They requested to remain in America, claiming that return to Japan would mean certain death from either hardline nationalists or families unable to accept the shame of surrender. American immigration law was complex and generally restrictive, but some exceptions were made, particularly for prisoners who had cooperated extensively with U.S. authorities. These men faced the hardest journey. They would live in the nation they had fought against, surrounded by people whose sons and brothers and fathers they might have killed. They would build lives in a language not their own, in a culture they barely understood, forever cut off from the world of their birth. But for some, that separation was freedom. Freedom from a system that had valued them only as instruments. Freedom from expectations they could never meet. Freedom to discover who they might be when they weren't defined by duty and nation and blood. The camps began to empty in late 1945 and through 1946. Ships carried prisoners back across the Pacific, reversing the journey they had made years before. The men who boarded those ships were not the same men who had been captured. War changes everyone, but the transformation of Japanese POWs in American camps went deeper than physical scars or combat fatigue. They had seen the enemy and found humanity. They had been treated according to laws that protected even those who had tried to kill their captors. They had been given food, medical care, even small dignities, when their own doctrine had prepared them for torture and death. And now they had to return to a Japan that had been burned and broken, where millions had died, where cities had been reduced to ash, and explain how they had survived in comfortable captivity while their countrymen suffered. Many chose never to speak of it. They returned to families, to villages, to a Japan under American occupation, and they buried their experiences in silence. The shame was too great. The questions too dangerous. Others found communities of former prisoners, men who understood, who had lived through the same impossible contradictions. In quiet gatherings years later they would share stories, compare experiences, try to make sense of what had happened to them. A small number became advocates for change in Japan. They had seen democracy in practice, however imperfectly. They had experienced individual rights and legal protections. As Japan rebuilt under American guidance, these men pushed for reforms, for a constitution that would limit government power, for a society where citizens had rights that couldn't be stripped away by military necessity. Their influence was subtle but real. The new Japan that emerged from the ashes incorporated many ideas that these prisoners had first encountered behind barbed wire in Texas and Wisconsin and New Mexico. But the psychological wounds never fully healed. Even decades later, survivors would speak of nightmares, of guilt that pursued them through quiet lives. They had survived when millions died. They had questioned when loyalty demanded faith. They had found unexpected mercy when they deserved none. How do you live with that knowledge? How do you integrate it into an identity that was shattered and rebuilt in captivity? Most never did. They lived split lives, public faces that conformed to expectations and private thoughts that they shared with no one. The camps had taught them that the world was more complicated than propaganda claimed, that enemies could be humane, that defeat didn't have to mean annihilation. But those lessons came at a cost that couldn't be calculated in meals served or wounds treated. The cost was certainty itself, the comfortable belief in absolutes that makes life simpler if not necessarily better. In the end, the Japanese prisoners who called American camps paradise weren't speaking of physical comfort, though that was part of it. They were speaking of a psychological space where the rigid categories that had defined their lives, honor and shame, victory and defeat, us and them, broke down and revealed something more complex underneath. That complexity was both liberation and burden. Liberation from lies but burden of truth. And truth, as they discovered, is often harder to live with than comforting falsehoods. * 1946-1950. Japan and America. * The ships that brought Japanese prisoners back to Japan docked at ports that barely existed anymore. Yokohama, Nagasaki, Kobe, cities that had been centers of commerce and culture were now landscapes of rubble and makeshift shelters. The prisoners walked down gangplanks into a nation they no longer recognized. Japan under occupation was a study in contradictions. American forces controlled the country, implementing reforms, dismantling the military apparatus, putting war criminals on trial. General MacArthur ruled from Tokyo with authority that exceeded what the emperor had once held. Yet there was also food distribution, medical care, and rebuilding efforts on a scale that surprised many Japanese civilians. For returning prisoners, the occupation created a strange environment. The Americans they had come to know in the camps were now everywhere, walking the streets with authority, fraternizing with Japanese civilians, imposing democracy like a military objective. Some former prisoners found work with occupation authorities, their English language skills and understanding of American culture making them valuable. Others tried to blend back into civilian life, claiming they had been wounded in combat rather than admit to capture and imprisonment. The silence around their experiences was enforced not by law but by social pressure. Families didn't want to discuss it. Communities preferred to forget. The entire subject of prisoners of war, particularly those who had survived comfortable captivity while civilians starved under American bombing, was deeply uncomfortable. A few tried to speak publicly about what they had experienced. They were generally ignored or criticized. One former prisoner who attempted to publish a memoir describing the humane treatment in American camps, found that publishers weren't interested. The narrative didn't fit. Japan was rebuilding its identity around victimhood and resilience. Stories of enemy mercy complicated that narrative. In America, most of the POW camps were decommissioned quickly. The barracks were sold off or torn down. The land returned to its previous use. Within a few years, little physical evidence remained of the vast system that had held hundreds of thousands of prisoners. A few camps became memorials or historical sites, but most simply vanished. Local communities that had hosted the camps often had mixed feelings. Some remembered positive interactions with prisoners. Others preferred to forget the presence of enemy soldiers on American soil. The prisoners who remained in America faced their own challenges. Immigration status, employment discrimination, and the lingering hatred of a nation that had lost sons to Japanese forces made life difficult. But there were also opportunities. The post-war boom created jobs. The GI Bill and similar programs sometimes extended to former POWs who agreed to stay. Some prisoners married American women, started businesses, became citizens. These men lived double lives in a different way than those who returned to Japan. They had to explain their accents, their backgrounds, their presence in a nation that had once been their enemy. Most created simple stories, eliding the complexity. I was in the war. I stayed after. The details remained private. By the 1950s, the camps were fading from memory. The Cold War had created new enemies, new concerns. Japan was now an ally, a bulwark against communism in Asia. The bitterness of World War II, while not forgotten, was being subordinated to new strategic realities. Former prisoners, whether in Japan or America, mostly kept silent. Their children, growing up in the post-war years, often knew little about their father's wartime experiences. The shame and complexity were too great to share easily. But the silence was not absolute. In private gatherings, in letters never published, in journals kept locked away, some prisoners recorded their experiences. They wrote about the paradox of being treated well by enemies, of discovering humanity in unexpected places, of the psychological crisis that had reshaped their understanding of the world. These documents, surfacing decades later in archives and estate sales, provide glimpses into minds transformed by experience that official histories often overlook. They speak of gratitude mixed with shame, of lessons learned but impossible to apply, of seeing beyond propaganda but finding no way to act on that vision. One document, a letter written by a former prisoner to his son in 1958, preserved in a Japanese historical society, captures the complexity. I tell you this not to make excuses but so you might understand. In the war, I learned that the enemy is also human. This should have been obvious but it was not. We were taught otherwise. When I was captured, I expected death. Instead, I found men who followed rules even when it would have been easier not to. They were not kind exactly. They were correct. And in that correctness there was a kind of mercy. I cannot tell you this made them good or us bad. War makes everyone complicit in evil. But I learned that even in war, some try to hold to principles beyond survival. This is worth remembering. Do not speak of this to others. They would not understand. But you should know that your father once believed absolute things, and those beliefs were broken, and in the breaking I saw more clearly. That clarity cost more than I can explain. By the 1960s and 1970s, as World War II veterans aged and began to reflect more publicly on their experiences, some former Japanese prisoners started sharing their stories. Academic researchers, interested in the psychology of captivity and cultural transformation, began conducting interviews. What emerged was a portrait of men caught between worlds. They had been raised in a culture that valued conformity, loyalty, and unquestioning obedience. They had been captured at the moment of ultimate failure. And then they had spent years in an environment that challenged every assumption they had been taught. Most described the experience as traumatic, not because of physical suffering but because of psychological dislocation. The ground had shifted beneath them. Certainties had dissolved. And there was no going back to the innocent faith of their youth. Some spoke of it as awakening. Others as destruction. A few simply said it was necessary, that they had needed to see beyond the lies before they could become fully human. The Americans who had run the camps, those few who were interviewed later, mostly emphasized practical concerns. They had followed regulations, maintained security, tried to prevent escapes and uprisings. If prisoners found the treatment humane, that was a side effect of following the law, not a deliberate strategy of kindness. But some camp administrators acknowledged a deeper intention. They had wanted to demonstrate that American values, whatever their practical failings, included treating even enemies with basic dignity. It was propaganda, yes, but propaganda rooted in principle. Whether this approach was effective in military terms is debatable. Many prisoners resisted until the end, maintaining their loyalty despite humane treatment. But for those who did transform, who did question and doubt and eventually accept that their former certainties were false, the impact was profound and lasting. These men became, in a sense, advanced scouts for a new Japan. They had seen what democracy could look like, however imperfectly practiced. They had experienced individual rights and legal protections. When Japan rebuilt itself with American guidance, these prisoners were among those who understood what was being offered, even if they could rarely speak openly about why they understood. The camps themselves left little physical trace, but their psychological legacy endured in the minds of men who had experienced them, and through those men in subtle ways in the culture of post-war Japan. Present day. Memory and reflection. The last survivors are gone now or nearly so. Men who were 20 in 1943 would be over 100 today. Their voices, recorded in interviews and memoirs, are all that remain of direct testimony. But the questions they raised persist. What does it mean to treat an enemy well? Is it weakness or strength? Does it make any difference in the outcome of war, or only in the souls of those who fight it? The Japanese prisoners who called American camps paradise weren't making a simple statement about material conditions, though those mattered. They were recognizing something more fundamental, that even in war, even between enemies who kill each other on battlefields, there remains the possibility of acknowledging shared humanity. This possibility doesn't end war. It doesn't make war just or necessary. But it suggests that even in the worst circumstances, there are choices about how to conduct oneself, about whether to follow rules that protect dignity even when breaking them would be easier and more satisfying. The American treatment of Japanese POWs was imperfect. There were abuses, failures of implementation, gaps between policy and practice. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, which was often brutal and sometimes murderous, created a moral clarity that obscures complexity. But the prisoners themselves, those who lived through it, spoke of confusion rather than clarity. They had expected monsters and found bureaucrats. They had prepared for torture and received medical treatment. The dissonance broke something in them that perhaps needed breaking, the absolute certainty that had made war possible in the first place. In the decades after World War II, as Japan became a democracy and American ally, the story of POW camps faded into background. It wasn't dramatic enough for movies, too complex for simple lessons. The heroes were ambiguous, the villains uncertain, the resolution unsatisfying. But history is rarely satisfying. It's messy and contradictory, filled with people making choices for mixed motives, trying to be decent in indecent circumstances, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always fundamentally human. The camps existed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners passed through them. Most returned to Japan or stayed in America and lived quiet lives, carrying memories they could rarely share. A few spoke, late in life, trying to explain something that couldn't quite be explained, how being treated with unexpected humanity by an enemy changed them in ways that victory never could have. They called it paradise, those prisoners. But it was never paradise. It was just the recognition, forced upon them by circumstance, that enemies are also human. That wars are fought by people who bleed in fear and hope and doubt. That realization didn't end war. Humans continued fighting, continued killing, continued finding reasons to hate. But for some men in those camps in Wisconsin and Texas and New Mexico, something shifted. The propaganda cracked. The certainty dissolved. And in that dissolution there was space for something new. Not peace. Not forgiveness. Just the quiet acknowledgement that the world is more complex than flags and anthems suggest, that honor might mean something different than they'd been taught, that surviving defeat could be its own kind of courage. The camps are gone now. The barracks torn down, the land repurposed, the bureaucratic records filed away in archives where few people look. The prisoners themselves are mostly gone, their stories fading into history. But the questions remain. How do we treat those we defeat? What obligations do we have to enemies? When rules protect human dignity, do we follow them even when it's inconvenient, even when the enemy wouldn't do the same? These aren't easy questions. The prisoners didn't find easy answers. They found only what everyone finds in war. That certainty is comforting but rarely true, that enemies are human, and that sometimes mercy is given not because it's deserved but because giving it preserves something in the giver that war tries to destroy. The paradise they found wasn't a place. It was a recognition. And that recognition, painful and confusing as it was, mattered more than they could have known at the time. It still matters. Not as a lesson exactly. History resists lessons. But as a reminder that even in the worst moments, even between enemies who have every reason to hate, there remains the possibility of treating each other as human. That possibility doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't prevent war or ensure justice. But it suggests that the choice exists always between cruelty and restraint, between revenge and law, between seeing enemies as monsters or as men. The Japanese prisoners made that discovery in American camps during World War II. They called it paradise because it was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they'd been taught, so psychologically devastating to accept. But it was never paradise. It was just humanity, imperfect and inconsistent, trying to remain human even in war. And that, perhaps, is as close to paradise as we get in this world. The war ended. The prisoners went home or stayed. The camps disappeared. But the recognition remained, in memories that were slowly forgotten, in stories rarely told, in documents filed away in archives. And in the quiet understanding carried by a few men who survived to old age, that enemies are also human, and that sometimes mercy matters not because it changes the outcome but because it changes those who give it. That's the legacy. Not triumph or tragedy. Just the stubborn persistence of humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The camps were not paradise. But they proved that even in war, paradise, the recognition of shared humanity remains possible. And that possibility, fragile and often ignored, is what we carry forward from their experience into our own uncertain future.